Just this week, I became one of the 20 million people to have had their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. Since the rollout of the vaccine, significant drops in transmission and death rate have been reported. Many people have expressed hope that the vaccine will provide a way out of lockdown and a return to normal life. For many, this new hope of freedom is making lockdown a bit more bearable. Hope is the belief or the knowledge that circumstances will get better. Hope has helped people keep going and survive the most desperate, life-threatening circumstances and situations. It's very powerful. One of Jesus' disciples, Peter, wrote letters of encouragement to Christians who were living in desperate circumstances, life-threatening circumstances. He talked to them about hope. In his first letter, he told them, if someone asks you about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. Peter knew the sustaining power of hope. So he wanted others to know and understand where his hope came from. He wanted others to share in that hope. So he was always ready to talk about it. Where did Peter's hope come from? It came from his faith in Jesus. His faith in who Jesus is, in what Jesus has done, and in what Jesus will do. You see, Peter was one of the first Christians and one of the first leaders of the Christian church. But Peter wasn't always a Christian. Some people become Christians very suddenly, very dramatically. But for many, for most, it's a gradual process. It was a gradual process for Peter. Social media, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, or Snapchat, is now an integral part of our lives. Whether it's posting photos or sharing personal news on a virtual wall, as people use social media, their lives unfold, one update at a time. Over the next few weeks, I'm going to look at a series of events from the life of Jesus' disciple, Peter. If Snapchat had been around 2,000 years ago, maybe Peter would have posted photos of these events on his virtual wall. Each one of these events from Peter's life helps us to understand how someone becomes a Christian. All these events are found in the Bible. And the first one is in Luke's Gospel, chapter 5. Now, if Peter had posted a photo of this event on Snapchat, it might have been of a huge pile of fish with the caption, "Greatest catch of all time." You see, Peter was a fisherman who'd allowed Jesus to use his fishing boat as a platform to teach a crowd of people who'd gathered on the beach. After he finished preaching, Jesus took on the role of ship's captain and told Peter to push the boat out into deep water and start fishing. Now, that might not seem very strange, but it was a well-known fact that on the Sea of Galilee, you caught fish at night in shallow water. not in broad daylight, in deep water. Jesus asked this experienced fisherman to go against years of fishing know-how and do something that must have seemed to him to be ridiculous. Jesus, who had been a carpenter by trade, not a fisherman. But despite his misgivings, Peter showed willingness. He obeyed. And Jesus worked an amazing miracle. Peter made the greatest catch of fish in his life. It was the biggest catch of fish that had ever been caught on that lake. Through this miracle, Peter recognized that God's power was working through Jesus in a remarkable way. That Jesus wasn't just an ordinary man. But not only that, Peter was overwhelmed by a sense of God's presence, a sense of God's holiness, of God's absolute moral purity. Being confronted with the awesome holiness of God's presence was a painful experience for Peter. It was as if Peter had been caught in the beam of a watchtower searchlight. He'd been found out. In the dazzling, brilliant light of God's holiness, Peter was utterly exposed. He realized that he was a sinner, someone who'd done wrong, someone who'd offended God, his creator, by all the wrong things that he thought and said and done. Realizing his total moral inadequacy, Peter fell on the ground in the middle of a huge pile of fish and cried out, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." The gradual process of becoming a Christian involves realizing our absolute moral bankruptcy before God. That in God's eyes, our moral bank account is badly overdrawn and completely in the red. We're all slipping around in the same moral quagmire. We're all splattered with the mud and filth of our sin. God's standard is perfection, and none of us match up. All of us, without exception, struggle with sinful tendencies, with sinful behavior, selfishness, greed, jealousy, pride, lust, anger, hatred. Sins which damage our lives and damage our relationships with other people. Worst of all, our sins have damaged our relationship with God, our Creator. They prevent us from knowing Him because He is holy, because He is perfect. During this encounter with Jesus, Peter discovered something about himself he never realized before. He saw himself for what he really was. A man who was sinful to his very core. A man whose behavior had offended God. This event in Peter's life deeply affected his conscience, and he realized and confessed his sinfulness. But he still didn't fully understand and appreciate who Jesus is. The Bible is a bit like that Watchtower searchlight that I mentioned earlier. It exposes our sinful nature and shows us what we're like in God's sight. But if that was all the Bible did, it would leave us feeling utterly depressed and hopeless. Thankfully, the Bible shows us so much more. It shows us the amazing love of God through the life, death, and resurrection of his Son, Jesus. God gave Jesus, who came into this world to sort out the problem, the mess of our sin, to make a way for us to be reconciled to God, to know him, and to be with him forever. Jesus came to give us hope. In my next video, we'll look at another episode from Peter's life, another milestone in his journey towards faith in Jesus.